all, and welcome to episode 15 of Dissemination Day, where we are going to be talking about a paper that seems to be interesting a lot of folk, unsurprisingly. This is the 2018 Hassiotis paper, Angela Hassiotis from UCL, I believe, on the clinical outcomes of staff training in positive behaviour support to reduce challenging behaviour in adults with intellectual disability, a cluster randomised control trial. One of the reasons that this paper has been so talked about recently is that, contrary to most of the evidence about PBS, this paper found that there was no perceived benefit from the treatment group receiving PBS training. And I think I said in the post earlier that I think it's so important we don't limit our research to papers that we think we're already going to agree with. I think it's really important that we engage with research that contradicts our own opinions and make sure that we are constantly open-minded to whether or not new evidence has come to light, or to whether or not there might be even a better approach than the one that we're already using. That being said, I'll take you through the paper. I will tell you what I thought about it. I will tell you some of the points that other people have highlighted, and then I will leave you to make your own decisions. As always, I start with the background of any paper that I'm looking at and why they consider this an important topic to research. So for this paper, a previous randomised control trial of PBS that was conducted focusing on a specialist PBS team. And this showed really promising results with regards to, I think it was the aberrant behaviour checklist that they looked at, the ABCC. Beyond that, observational studies have showed that training of care staff reduces challenging behaviour. So this is the Gray and McLean paper from 2007. And staff training has been shown to increase knowledge and perceived confidence in managing challenging behaviour. So there was already a degree of existing research there. They argued that the 2014 RCT was the only existing RCT. And so they wanted to add to the body of evidence from randomised control trials. If anyone's not familiar, and this is harking back a long way for me to my research methods days, but the RCT, the randomised control trial, is considered the gold standard of evidence in a lot of fields. It's quite unusual in our field, in behaviour analysis, because they are incredibly difficult to conduct with such individualised programmes. Equally, there are lots of ethical questions around withholding treatment to a large group of people who could potentially benefit from it, so that is often a barrier. And if you are interested, there is a very interesting paper by Dillenberger and Keenan, I think it's called. It's about RCTs, and I will put a link to it here, and about why RCTs are not necessarily always the be-all or end-all when it comes to demonstrating good research evidence. That being said, trying to build the body of evidence for PBS is a noble endeavour, and the rationales and objectives that they had for this study, I think, were very good. So firstly, they wanted to compare the clinical effectiveness of staff training in PBS with treatment as usual over the course of 12 months. So just to highlight the fact, they were not actually looking at the implementation of PBS as such, they were looking at the outcomes of staff training in PBS, and for those of us who've worked in this field for a while, those are two quite different things. Beyond that, so that was their primary measure, was the clinical impact of this staff training programme on positive behaviour support, in positive behaviour support on specific measures. Secondly, they wanted to examine the impact of PBS in a subgroup of people with autism, so they wanted to look directly at the autistic population and see if it had different outcomes there. And finally, they wanted to examine any potential interactions between the intervention and gender, level of intellectual disability, whether or not the person had a mental health problem, and the existence of challenging behaviour. They used a number of different measures, including the aberrant behaviour checklist and a variety of pre and post measures that I will give you a list of shortly. The methodology for this paper is, it's very clinical, but I think for people who are used to single case design, the description of the methodology is probably a little bit like, wow. So they described it personally as a multi-centre, single-blind, parallel two-arm cluster, RCT, of 23 community intellectual disability services in England with active recruitment. So to break that down for anyone who's justifiably a bit baffled, let's take that bit by bit. So multi-centre means that more than one service was involved in this case, and that is always going to be the preferred approach, because you don't necessarily know if you just have like one really great service, one really great company that's doing it in a particular way, and that would confound your results. It's not actually the PBS training, it's something else potentially. Single blind means that the people who were evaluating the results didn't know whether or not the individual they were assessing or the individual's results that they were assessing came from the treatment group or the treatment as usual group. So that is really important, because it means that whenever you're making a decision, is this a meaningful outcome, you're not in any way biased about whether or not that person belonged to the group receiving the staff training or the person that belonged to the group that did not receive that training. And that might in some way influence how you perceive those results. The way that they did it here, sometimes when you do a single blind, it's the person, if it's for example, a medical RCT or a medication RCT, then it would be the person taking the medication doesn't know if they're in treatment or placebo. Obviously, that wouldn't be possible this way around, because you would know whether or not you were receiving a behaviour intervention. So it was the other way around. It was the researcher, the person evaluating the results, that didn't know. The term parallel relates to the fact that some people are receiving the treatment and some people don't, as opposed to some people receive it at the start and then we kind of, the next people do and the next people do and the next people do. And two-arm cluster refers to the fact that there are two groups of services in this particular example. So instead of two, they defined a cluster, I think, in this particular paper as a group of services. So there are two clusters, two groups of services. One group of services is receiving the PBS training intervention and the other group is not. In total, they had 23 community services supporting people with intellectual disability, all of which were in England as well. When it comes to participants, they started with 28 services that had agreed to take part. 5 of those dropped out, and that left them with 11 allocated to the intervention group and 12 to the treatment as usual TAU group alone, which means that they're just going about their business as usual on a daily basis. From each of those services, a maximum of 14 people with intellectual disability and behaviour that challenges were selected based on a baseline score in the Aberrant Behaviour Checklist community, which is a picture of that shown there. They specifically excluded individuals with personality disorder or substance misuse backgrounds, and they did that on the basis that they felt that there wasn't a great deal of evidence supporting the use of PBS in these populations already. And finally, services with existing PBS therapists or local specialist behaviour teams were excluded because obviously the point is to compare PBS provision versus no PBS provision, not PBS provision from the Hassiotis study versus PBS provision from PBS UK, for example. And now we get into the nitty-gritty of the procedure. So I was really interested in reading this to try and figure out what it was exactly they had done. And I've read it a couple of times now, and I think I've got my head around it. But ultimately, they had, from each of the areas that had agreed to participate and that were going to be part of the treatment group, 2 members of the community health team staff volunteered to receive training. And there was quite a variety of professionals who I think ultimately took part in this training, including psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, OTs, and SLTs. After that, there was a manager agreement reported that the managers agreed to reduce the volunteer caseload by 30% in order to facilitate them participating in this research project. And the training itself was conducted over 3 2-day face-to-face workshops, supported with the use of a manual and delivered by an organisation that was referred to as having a track record in training delivery. This threw up a bunch of questions for me across a number of different things. First of all, who did the training and did their baseline qualifications meet with, for example, the PBS Academy training standards or practitioner standards? Are we receiving training from board certified behaviour analysts or someone who has an equivalent level of experience and specialism? And was it competency-based training or was it just like classroom style training? None of those, I couldn't find answers I didn't find answers in my reading to any of those, but people may have asked those questions subsequently and know the answers now. The training content was reported as follows, and some fairly sensible modules here. So they started off with functional behaviour assessment and formulation, and they reported using the brief behaviour assessment tool, which comes from the University of the Health Board of ABMU, and it is a very good tool. I still use it myself sometimes, not in the way that I think I used to, but sometimes I will use it during an initial assessment just to make sure that I've kind of covered all bases in my indirect assessment. Then they went on to primary prevention of challenging behaviour, then secondary prevention and reactive strategies, and finally they had a session on periodic service review and problem solving. They also reported that each of the volunteers was provided with 12 months worth of mentoring, which included monthly teleconferences and site visits, which were also conducted. They took a bunch of measures, which was really interesting, but their primary measure was an individual score on the Aberrant Behaviour Checklist community over the period of 12 months, and I think they did a baseline, a 6-month and a 12-month assessment. That was their primary assessment, and then they went on to look at some secondary assessments, including symptoms according to the PASAD, the Guernsey Community Participation and Leisure Assessment, which is a quality of life and kind of a community inclusion assessment, Family Carer Burden Scale, Family Carer Psychiatric Morbidity, Caregiving Difficulty Scale, which is a non-family caregiver assessment, and these were all administered at 3 points. Like I say, I think it was a baseline 6-month and 12-month throughout the trial. The results were ultimately a bit sad, well, from my perspective. So 87% of the intervention group completed and 92% of the treatment as usual group completed the follow-up, which is good retention in my opinion. I'm not sure whether they were happy with it, but I think that looks pretty good. The intervention was not found to be statistically significant with regards to the scores for the Aberrant Behaviour Checklist when compared with treatment as usual. Both groups did go down slightly, but not significantly different to one another. And there was no significant effect between subgroups found, which I think is really, at first glance, really, really disappointing. And I remember this paper being published and lots of people being kind of like, oh my God, look at this, this is dreadful, it's not supporting PBS. I specifically remember one friend texting me being like, have you seen this? This is not good. What's very interesting is, you look at those results and you do think, yikes, that's a real shame. But when we're going to go on now and we're going to look at some of the limitations of this study, and we'll see whether or not, you guys need to make your decision whether or not you agree with me, but I think there are quite a few points here that need asking. And actually, if you look at and you interpret this study in the right way, I think it's telling us what we already know. I don't think it's telling us that PBS doesn't work. I think it's supporting our own understanding of what needs to happen for PBS to be effective. Okay, let's have a look at some of these limitations. In 5 cases of treatment as usual, and I'm not sure whether this is within the total of 12, 5 out of 12 is quite a lot, it was revealed that trial participants lived in accommodation where the provider had offered PBS awareness seminars or employed consultants to advise. Now, that sentence was in the paper. They did admit that, but in my mind, that's absolutely huge, because surely that renders that suddenly it's not treatment as usual. If that is the case, it's PBS being delivered by a person out with the research project, and that would, logically make those groups indistinguishable. On top of that, staff skills or knowledge weren't measured, which means that we aren't actually sure if the people in the services have, any of the training content has been disseminated to them. So we're not sure if the individuals who were initially trained were necessarily the right people to be doing this intervention. So community health teams, in my experience, are not always, they don't always have a massive presence in particular services. And one of the things that we understand as being really important to PBS is practice leadership. So it's not clear to me from reading this study where that practice leadership element came from. if there was a sufficient service presence to be able to facilitate the coaching, practice leadership and knowledge dissemination that is required to really fuel behaviour change programmes. And finally, if in some of those services, if the community health team volunteer wasn't there, that would then mean that they weren't receiving PBS, and in the treatment as usual group, we're hearing that there are consultants potentially doing it. Moving on, of a possible 108 intervention reports, only 33 of those included all elements that had been recommended as part of the training. So what is that? It's about 30%, maybe? Only about 30% of the actual reports that were given back to the researchers contained the types of programming that the volunteers had been trained to deliver. So I think that's just, again, going to be a massive limitation. That means that potentially 70% of them weren't really what had been intended anyway. For 28 participants, no paperwork at all was submitted, which means that we can't even be sure that anything was done. All plans were rated as weak by an independent assessor, and again, this is massive. There is a huge amount of variation. Not all PBS rates the same. There is very much a difference between well-conducted PBS and not well-conducted PBS. And if all of the plans are being rated as weak, then that would indicate that the procedures and the methodologies behind these plans, we wouldn't necessarily have faith were going to be effective anyway. And finally, they didn't measure implementation. They only measured whether or not the report had been submitted or a plan was in place, and whether or not that plan was rated as weak or otherwise. And as we know, it was weak. There was no measurement around whether or not that plan was taken out of the folder at any point and put into practice. So I think we need to be very, very careful about interpreting these results as suggesting anything other than crap, PBS doesn't work. So how do we avoid some of these kinds of issues? There are lots of limitations here, and actually there are two really good research papers, one by Dave Allen, I think, and one by Anne MacDonald, both of which are focused on a response to this paper and picking apart some of the issues with it, so that individuals who maybe don't understand PBS because that's not their job role, but they're looking to assess whether or not it would be the right thing for their organisation or the right thing for their loved ones. They're going to pick up this paper and be like, oh, well, this doesn't support the use of PBS. And I think that it's really important that we are clear about what this paper actually tells us and how we avoid some of the issues that have come out of this paper. First of all, I think we're going to make sure we're training the right people. So it is clear to me from my personal experience, and this paper supports it, that the individuals who are most likely to be able to affect change in a service are the people who are working and living and breathing in that service. Interestingly, the PBS Matters Brian McLean podcast came out yesterday, and I would absolutely recommend that everyone goes and listens to this because he's very engaging. But one of the things that he said was absolutely that he had absolute confirmation during the course of his experience that the right people to be delivering behaviour intervention or positive behaviour support programs are the individuals who are the staff who know these individuals the best, not people who are working through them from a distance as such, or not people who've only met them for a short period of time. Secondly, we've got to make sure that any kind of training program focuses on practice leadership and it measures implementation. You cannot know whether an intervention is successful if you don't know whether or not it was implemented. And I've done a blog post about this before, where we've got this kind of I have this little campaign in my head, burn the PBS plan. I am tired, and many of you are also probably tired, of PBS being measured by the presence of a PBS plan. If we're determining whether or not a service is doing PBS, then that is measured by whether or not there's a PBS plan in the folder, and that is just absolute nonsense. We need to look at what kind of training actually makes a difference, because there's lots of research to support staff training in PBS, but obviously, and this paper supports this, it's got to be the right kind of training. And it's got to be training delivered to the right people at the right level and making sure they have the right support. One of the things that Anne MacDonald highlighted was the lack of organisational input into this study. So the PBS training was delivered to community health teams, but we know that if an organisation isn't wholly committed to the implementation of PBS and the senior management structures are not going to support it, then it will not be successful. So we're not sure whether or not this has been addressed in any way as part of this study, and we know that it should be addressed if we're really expecting to see culture or organisational or individual change even in services. And the last bit I was curious about is whether or not it used a tiered system. So the PBS Academy standards are very helpful for identifying what levels of experience / qualifications a person should have to be able to lead behaviour support for a particular complexity of individual. And there wasn't any kind of clarity here around what tier, if we're talking about the PBIS school-wide framework, the individuals receiving the behaviour intervention would have been classified as. And the potential, therefore, is that we have individuals who've received 6 days training, which is comparatively quite a lot. Lots of people don't get 6 days training, and potentially trying to lead behaviour change programmes for individuals that would classify as a tier 1, which would not be in line with the PBS Academy standards. So I think there's lots of questions around that too. Just one final point that jumped into my head there is that when I say we need to look at the right people and engaging in this training, making sure that we have the right people leading on PBS plans, that wasn't in any way meant to be a criticism of the community health teams, who I'm sure are competent and engaging human beings. There were lots of complications that came up there. Many of them reported that 30% reduction in workload didn't occur for them. That didn't happen, and therefore they were not facilitated to do the work that they had been asked to do. Secondly, for many of these individuals, PBS would not be their primary remit. They already have a full-time job that is really, really important, that have individuals requiring their skills, and they're being asked to lead on these programs on top of that. These are not conducive conditions to positive behaviour change. We need to make sure that the individuals who are responsible for leading PBS programs are supported to do so, and I am not convinced that they were in these circumstances. Okay, so I could have talked about this paper for hours because there's just so much to say. And I think the only thing I can realistically do is echo what I am told Professor McGill said upon hearing about this paper, which was to say thank you to Angela Hassiotis for confirming what we already know, which is that training alone isn't enough. And particularly when when services are saying they're doing PBS, we need to be very critical, constructively critical, about whether or not, what that means at a ground level, and whether or not we're satisfied that it meets the standards that are being recommended. And we just cannot be surprised that rubbish PBS isn't working, that weak plans aren't having an impact, that plans that aren't being written aren't having an impact, and that plans that are potentially being written but sitting in a folder for a long time aren't having an impact because the poor individuals who put the time into writing them are not being facilitated to support their implementation. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to harp on again about the Burn the PBS Plan agenda, but I will say that I think this paper is well worth a read, particularly from an organisational level. But I would recommend that once you have read it, you go and you read particularly Anne MacDonald's commentary, the 2018 commentary, which can be found, I'll leave a link to that, and you also direct yourselves, if necessary, to the PBS Academy standards for training, for services and for practitioners, to make sure that if you are investing in PBS services for your organisation or for your loved ones, that you make sure that the services you are commissioning, the services that you are supporting, have the best chance possible of being successful, because clearly there is evidence that when we don't make that investment, or the conditions, the environment isn't conducive to supporting that investment, then it won't work. See you later.